He used all his medicine to cure a dying alien woman. Days later, she returned with 5 ships. If you enjoy this channel, please check to see if you're subscribed. The proximity alarm screamed 3 minutes after Alvin had stripped down to his thermal underlayer, which meant he'd be suiting up in the storm with half his skin exposed to recycled air that hadn't been properly filtered in 6 weeks. He slapped the console silent and squinted at the trajectory plot. Something had punched through Kale-9's orbital debris field at an angle that would have shattered any human craft into expensive confetti. Flesh Unit, the mining drone's holographic eye flickered to life above the command terminal, its voice dripping with synthetic concern. That signature reads as a controlled crash. Someone survived entry. Great. Alvin yanked his jumpsuit back on, fingers working the seals by muscle memory while his steel-gray eyes tracked the impact coordinates. 2 kilometers northwest, past the primary excavation site where the automated rigs hummed their eternal song of productivity. The main crew had evacuated 5 months ago when the dust season rolled in, taking the bulk supplies and leaving medical stores at minimum spec. Standard corporate efficiency. Alien physiology. Just what my resume needed. He grabbed his emergency kit, the personal cash he'd been rationing since the court-martial, since they'd stripped his field medic certification and buried him on this automated rock, and hit the airlock. The storm wrapped around him like a living thing, particulate matter that could strip paint at 50 meters. His goggles turned the world amber and grainy. Dust hissed against his helmet. The pod gleamed through the murk like a pearl in mud. Sleek, organic curves that human engineering had never mastered, still radiating heat from atmospheric friction. Alvin circled it twice, noting the emergency hatches, the way the hull had peeled open in precise segments rather than shattering. Escape craft, military grade. The kind of vessel that cost more than Kale-9's entire annual output. The hatch release responded to pressure in 3 places simultaneously. The interior smelled like warm copper and something floral he had no reference for. She was crumpled against the pilot cradle, and his breath stopped. Green skin, deep emerald, glistening with sweat that caught the pod's dying emergency lights. Violet hair matted to one cheek in strands that seemed to drink the illumination. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. When he touched her throat to check her pulse, her skin felt like sun-warmed stone, and something beneath the surface flickered, a pattern of light tracing her veins from collarbone to jawline, strobing erratically. Toxin presentation, he muttered, already running diagnostics in his head. The veins pulsed faster when he pressed his fingers to her wrist. Pain response. Her biology was screaming in a language he didn't speak yet. Alvin got his arms under her shoulders and knees, lighter than he expected, maybe 90 pounds, and hauled her into the storm. She made a sound against his chest, alien tongue clicking in rhythm with her breathing, and those subdermal lights went wild. By the time he reached the airlock, his arms were shaking and her temperature had spiked enough that he could feel it through both layers of gloves. The medbay smelled like antiseptic and abandonment. He laid her on the primary cot, stripped away the remnants of what might have been a flight suit, and took inventory. His personal cache, 6 broad-spectrum anti-venom doses, 4 pain blocker ampules, 2 coagulant patches, and a prayer. The outpost stores had been stripped to skeleton levels when the crew evacuated, leaving him with bandages and diagnostic equipment, but nothing that could touch systemic poisoning. Her back arched suddenly, vertebrae pressing against green skin, and those bioluminescent veins blazed from fingertips to throat. Rapid strobing. The pattern burned itself into his memory. Pain signature, maximum intensity. Her pupils were blown wide, liquid gold irises reduced to thin rings. 4-fingered hands clenched, and he saw the obsidian claws for the first time, 1 centimeter of curved black that could probably open his throat before he registered the movement. Stay with me. He loaded the first anti-venom dose into the injector, modified the compression setting based on pure educated guessing, and pressed it to her throat where the carotid equivalent should be. Her skin resisted the needle for a fraction of a second before yielding. He pushed the plunger smooth and steady. Her reaction was immediate and violent. She convulsed hard enough that he had to pin her shoulders, veins flaring in patterns he'd never seen, spirals and crosshatches and something that looked almost like text. Her mouth opened and she screamed, the sound pitched wrong for human ears, and then her eyes rolled back. Alvin counted her heartbeats against his palm, 80 per minute, 60, 40, 30, 28 and holding. He sagged against the cot's edge, pressed his forehead to the cool metal frame, and let himself shake. The injector clattered from his fingers to the floor. Through the observation window, Kale 9's twin moons rose over the dust storm, and the automated drones kept singing their mining songs, and the woman who might be royalty or refugee or something else entirely breathed in rhythm with his own hammering pulse. 5 more doses left. 3 days, maybe 4 if he stretched them. After that, he'd be gambling with improvisation, and the last time he'd done that, they'd court-martialed him and buried him alive on an asteroid with machines for company. Her hand twitched. Those bioluminescent veins slowed from frantic strobing to something more regular. Slow waves rolling from wrist to shoulder and back again. He watched them for 10 minutes, learning the syntax of her biology, and when she finally settled into unconscious stillness, he allowed himself to hope. The storm howled outside. The drones hummed. Alvin pulled up the second cot and positioned it beside hers, close enough that he could monitor her breathing without instruments, and settled in for a long watch. 3 days. He could keep someone alive for 3 days, even if it killed him. Probably would. Hour 36, and Alvin had learned to read her like instrument panels. The bioluminescent veins were a language he'd been reverse engineering through pure necessity. Rapid pulses meant the pain was cresting, slow waves indicated something approaching stability, and the erratic flickers that made his chest tight always preceded seizures. He'd administered 4 more doses at staggered intervals, each one pushing the boundaries of human pharmacology into xenobiological territory that should have required 3 advanced degrees and institutional approval. Instead, he had calloused hands, a diagnostic scanner that kept throwing error codes, and a growing certainty that the anti-venom was causing vivid hallucinations as a side effect. She'd woken twice. The first time, her pupils had contracted to vertical slits when she'd grabbed his wrist hard enough to bruise, 4 fingers locking around bone, and the clicking sounds from her throat had risen and fallen with desperate cadence, trying to communicate, trying to warn him or thank him or curse him in a language that predated human spaceflight. He'd pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, recycled water, rationed from his personal supply, and kept his voice low and steady. "You're safe. Fever dreams. The toxin's breaking down, but the treatment's showing you things that aren't real." Her grip had loosened. Those gold eyes had focused on his face with devastating clarity, searching for something, and then she'd slipped back under. The second time, hour 42, she'd tried to sit up. Alvin had been cataloging his remaining supplies. 2 doses left, maybe 3 if he cut them with saline and hoped her metabolism could handle the dilution, when he'd heard the cot creak. He'd turned to find her vertical, green skin slicked with fresh sweat, violet hair falling across bare shoulders. The flight suit remnants were still on the floor where he'd cut them away. He'd draped her with a thermal blanket that had immediately slid to her waist. Down. He'd moved without thinking, hands on her shoulders, and the contact had sent those veins spiraling in patterns he was starting to associate with awareness, not pain, not fear, something closer to recognition. "Your core temperature spiked 20 minutes ago. You need to stay horizontal." She'd looked at his hands like they were miracles, turned her own palms up, studied the injection sites at her wrists, the faint bruising that bloomed purple-black against emerald. Then she'd reached up and touched his face. 4 fingers, impossibly gentle, tracing the line of his jaw. Her skin was still too hot, but her touch was deliberate, mapping the architecture of his face the way he'd been mapping her vital signs. When her thumb had brushed his lower lip, his breath had caught. "Why?" The word had come out in accented standard, shaped awkwardly around alien vocal anatomy. "Why didn't you let me die?" Alvin had been court-martialed for improvisation, exiled for caring too much about civilian casualties when the profit margins said to cut losses. He'd burned every bridge to save people who'd never know his name. The answer was simple and impossible to articulate. Waste of a good story, he'd said. Her expression had done something complicated. Those vertical pupils had dilated slightly, veins pulsing in slow, rolling waves that he'd tentatively labeled as contentment? Trust? Then she'd swayed and he'd caught her before she could pitch forward off the cot. The blanket had fallen completely. He'd been a field medic for 9 years. He'd seen anatomy in every configuration survival and trauma could arrange. But his hands had hesitated on green skin, on the subtle musculature of her back, on the way those bioluminescent veins formed constellations along her spine. Down, he'd repeated, and eased her horizontal, pulled the blanket to her collarbones, pressed 2 fingers to her throat and counted her pulse until it steadied. She'd watched him the entire time with those gold eyes, and when he'd finally stepped back to give her space, she'd caught his hand. 4 fingers laced through 5. Her grip had been weak but insistent. Alvin had sat on the edge of her cot, their hands joined in the narrow space between heartbeats, and kept vigil. The medbay's recycled air had hummed through filters that needed replacing. Outside, the storm had continued its work of scouring Kale 9 down to bare rock. Inside, her breathing had deepened into something approaching natural sleep, and those veins had dimmed to a soft, steady glow. Hour 54, the hallucinations had peaked. She'd thrashed hard enough that he'd had to restrain her, pinning her wrists above her head while she'd screamed in Veilari. The words had been meaningless, but the tone had been universal. Betrayal, rage, grief. Her claws had extended fully, obsidian black, and he'd felt one nick his forearm before she'd gone limp. Blood had welled, human red against weathered skin, and she'd focused on it with sudden, horrible clarity. "No," she'd whispered, still in standard voice wrecked. "Not you, not the human who—" Then unconscious again. Alvin had bandaged his arm, administered the 6th and penultimate dose, and allowed himself 60 seconds to sit on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands shaking. 1 vial left, maybe 36 hours before her metabolism either adapted or collapsed. No backup, no reinforcements, no corporate extraction team coming to clean up the mess. Just him and an alien woman whose name he didn't know, dying slowly in a medbay designed for industrial accidents and sprained ankles. He'd hauled himself upright and repositioned his cot so that the frames were touching. Close enough that her breathing was the only sound besides his own. Close enough that when her hand had stretched out in sleep, searching, it had found his shoulder and anchored there. The veins had pulsed softly against his skin, slow waves, calm, maybe even safe. Alvin had closed his eyes and counted her heartbeats until dawn. Dawn on Kale 9 meant the storm paused to catch its breath. Alvin woke to thin gray light filtering through the medbay's reinforced windows and the immediate knowledge that something had changed. The weight on his shoulder was gone. He sat up fast enough to make his vision swim, hand already reaching for the diagnostic scanner before his brain caught up to his training. She was standing. Tyria, he still didn't know her name, would kick himself for that later, stood beside the cot in the thermal blanket wrapped around her waist like a skirt, torso bare, violet hair falling in straight lines past her shoulder blades. The bioluminescent veins under her skin pulsed in steady, measured patterns, slow waves, not pain, not fever, something closer to resolve. Her posture had transformed overnight. Yesterday she'd been dyeing tissue and desperate biology. Today her spine was perfectly vertical, chin parallel to the floor, shoulders back. Regal. The word hit him like a diagnosis. She stood like someone who'd worn crowns, given orders, watched empires from throne rooms. "You're up," Alvin said, stupidly, because his brain was still cataloging the impossibility. 72 hours ago she'd been coding on his cot. 12 hours ago the hallucinations had nearly broken her. Now she looked like she could walk through the storm unprotected and make it kneel. "The toxin is—" She paused, searching for words in standard, one hand pressed to her sternum, where the largest concentration of veins formed a lattice. "Neutralized. Your medicine is crude but effective. My body has adapted." That's not how broad-spectrum antivenoms work. He stood, closed the distance between them in 3 steps, reached for her wrist to check her pulse before remembering himself. Professional detachment. She wasn't his patient anymore, wasn't the dying woman he'd sacrificed his survival cushion to save. She was something else now, something dangerous and unknown. You should still be? She caught his hand before it could drop, turned his palm upward, studied the calluses, the scars from shrapnel and improvised tools, the chemical burns on his fingertips from jury-rigging medical equipment under field conditions. Her thumb traced the lifeline like she was reading prophecy. Why? She asked again, the question she'd posed in delirium. But her voice was stronger now, melodic alto with soft clicks on the hard consonants. You burned your reserves. This outpost has minimal supplies. You made yourself vulnerable for a stranger whose name you don't even know. Alvin met those liquid gold eyes, vertical pupils still slightly dilated from the medication, and told the truth. Seemed like the thing to do at the time. Her expression did something complicated. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a human smile, but close enough to translate, and those veins spiraled in patterns he'd learned meant heightened emotion. Not fear, not pain, something warmer. Tyria, she said, crown heir of the Veilari Dominion, exile, poisoned by my own blood 3 cycles ago. The formal cadence cracked slightly, saved by a human who doesn't know when to stop being noble. Alvin, disgraced combat medic, court-martialed for caring more about civilians than protocol, exiled to this rock to babysit automated mining equipment. He shrugged, felt the weight of his own failures like physical mass. We make a pair. Tyria released his hand, but slowly, like she was memorizing the texture. She moved to where he'd laid out her destroyed flight suit and knelt. The motion shockingly graceful for someone who'd been dying 72 hours ago to retrieve something from the torn fabric. The empty vial from his final injection. Glass that had held the last of his pharmaceutical safety net. She pressed it to her lips. The gesture was deliberate, reverent, almost ritualistic. Then she straightened and moved to face him again, close enough that he could smell the warm copper and crushed night-blooming petals scent that was apparently intrinsic to Veilari biology. Close enough that when she lifted one 4-fingered hand to his cheek, he felt the warmth radiating through her palm. I will remember, she said, voice dropping to something private. Every human who asks why I trust your species, I will tell them, one of you gave me everything when I had nothing to offer in return. Then she kissed his palm, pressed her lips to the center where his lifeline and heart line intersected, and held there long enough that he felt the soft click of her breathing against his skin. Lingering, deliberate, a promise or a goodbye or something that transcended translation. When she pulled back, her veins were spiraling in patterns he'd never seen, complicated overlapping pulses that made his chest tight. The pod's main transmitter, she said, switching back to formal cadence. I need to activate it. My people have been searching since the emergency beacon triggered at impact. They're close now. I can feel it. Alvin nodded, throat too tight for words. He helped her into his spare jumpsuit, too large, sleeves rolled 3 times, and watched her walk into the storm like she owned it. The pod's interior lights flickered to life. Through his goggles, he saw her silhouetted against alien instrumentation, fingers dancing across controls that responded to her touch with eager readiness. The transmission pulse lit up his console 6 minutes later. Broad spectrum, powerful enough to punch through the dust and reach orbital monitoring stations. Someone was listening. Someone would come. Tyria emerged from the pod and paused halfway back to the outpost, turned to look at him standing in the airlock, and even through the storm and amber-tinted goggles, he saw her veins flare bright enough to rival the emergency lights. Then she kept walking, past him, past the med bay, to the main hangar where escape craft were docked for crew evacuations. Her pod's engines ignited with a sound like controlled thunder. Alvin stood in the airlock and watched her leave, watched the sleek alien craft rise through dust that should have shredded anything human-made, watched it punch through Kale-9's thin atmosphere, watched it become a bright point against the black before vanishing entirely. The storm resumed its work. The drones hummed their mining songs. He went inside, stripped off the environment suit, and stared at the empty med bay for longer than was healthy. The vial she'd kept felt important. The kiss felt like fire on his palm. The knowledge that he'd just used his last medical reserves on someone he'd never see again felt like the most predictable ending to his story. He pulled his oxygen ration report and did the math. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if he cut his exertion. Then suffocation or hope, whichever came first. Outside, Kale 9's automated systems kept humming. The universe moved on, and Alvin sat on the edge of the empty cot where an alien crown heir had learned to trust a disgraced human medic and wondered if noble stupidity was hereditary. 3 days later, Alvin was elbow-deep in the primary oxygen recycler when the proximity alarm started screaming. Not the single warning tone from Tyria's crash. The cascade alert that meant multiple large-mass objects had just decloaked within weapons range. His heart stopped for the 2 seconds it to wipe the grease from his hands and sprint to the command terminal. The screen lit up with 5 contacts, each one broadcasting power signatures that made Kale 9's entire industrial output look like a birthday candle. Corvettes, military-grade, matte-black hulls that drank sensor scans, no Empire insignias visible even at maximum magnification. They'd materialized in a defensive formation around the asteroid, weapons cold but tracking solutions already locked on the outpost's critical systems. Flesh unit. The mining drone's holographic eye flickered with what might have been concern in a machine capable of emotion. Those vessels are broadcasting a priority diplomatic code. Someone very important wants to talk to you. The main screen flickered. Alvin found himself staring at a Veilari officer, whose violet braid was shot through with silver, whose left arm ended in a cybernetic limb that moved with liquid precision, whose eyes held the weight of decades watching people die. Human. The word came out with a soft click of respect that contradicted the hard set of her jaw. You sheltered the crown heir. For this you have our gratitude. The formality cracked slightly. And her personal summons. You will board the Nightshade within the hour. I'm not, Alvin started, then stopped, because what could he say? That he was court-martialed? That he was serving penance on a rock that barely qualified as habitable? That the idea of walking onto an alien warship after 3 days of believing he'd never see Tyria again made his hands shake? Give me 20 minutes. He packed what mattered, the footlocker of Bantech prototypes, his medic certification chip that still carried his service record, a data stick with photos from before everything went wrong. Left everything else. The outpost would run itself until the main crew returned after dust season, or it wouldn't, and either way it wasn't his problem anymore. The shuttle that docked at Kale 9's main hangar was sleek and predatory, all curved lines and concealed weapons ports. 2 Veilari soldiers in matte armor flanked the hatch, their bioluminescent veins visible at throat and wrists, pulsing in synchronized patterns that probably meant something tactical. They didn't speak, just gestured him aboard with 4-fingered hands. The interior smelled like warm copper and something that might have been incense. Alvin strapped into a crash couch designed for bodies shaped differently than his and tried not to think about the last time he'd been in a military vessel. The acceleration when they launched was smooth enough that his inner ear barely registered movement, technology so far beyond human standard that it might as well be magic. The Nightshade swallowed the shuttle whole. Hangar bay the size of a terrestrial warehouse, deck plates that hummed with power, crew moving in choreographed patterns that spoke to years of training, and waiting at the base of the shuttle ramp, backlit by overhead lights that turned her violet hair into something from mythology. Tyria. She wore matte black ceremonial armor now, fitted so precisely it might have been grown rather than forged. Silver filigree traced patterns along the high collar, down her arms, across her torso, in designs that echoed the bioluminescent veins beneath. Her hair was braided with silver cords, pulled back to expose the elegant line of her throat. And her eyes, those liquid gold eyes with vertical pupils, locked on him with devastating focus. Alvin descended the ramp. His steel-gray eyes catalogued everything. The way her crew stood at attention but watched him with naked curiosity, the way her hands were clasped behind her back in formal parade rest, the way her veins pulsed in slow, steady waves that he'd learned meant calm or control. With Tyria, they often meant both. She moved before he reached the deck, crossed the distance in 3 strides, and dropped to one knee. The hangar went silent. 50 Velari soldiers froze mid-motion. The loyalist captain with the silver-streaked braid and cybernetic arm looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "You gave me breath," Tyria said, voice carrying in the sudden quiet, head bowed so that he was looking at the crown of violet braids and silver cord. "I return it with worlds." She extended one four-fingered hand, palm up. A formal gesture, clearly, laden with meaning he only half understood. Alvin stared at her kneeling on alien deck plates in armor that probably cost more than his lifetime salary, offering him something that felt heavier than gravity. His hands were still calloused, still scarred from improvised tools and field modifications, still stained with grease from the oxygen recycler. He looked at them, then at her, then at the assembled crew, watching with expressions ranging from shock to what might have been approval. "Get up," he said quietly. "Don't kneel for me." "Then stand beside me." She rose in one fluid motion, and suddenly they were eye to eye, green skin and weathered human tan, violet and dark brown, alien biology and improvised medicine. Her hand was still extended. "My medic, my engineer, my human who doesn't know when to stop being noble." Alvin took her hand, 4 fingers laced through 5, her skin warm against his, those bioluminescent veins spiraling in patterns that made his chest tight. Around them, the crew resumed breathing. "Where are we going?" he asked. Virili. The name came out like prayer. "My garden moon, the only place in the Dominion where my sister's fleets don't patrol." Her grip tightened slightly. "Where 5 ships can become an army if the human variable is willing to teach us improvisation." The human variable. He turned the phrase over in his mind, felt the weight of it. Not just the anti-venom that had saved her life. Not just the biochemistry. Something larger. The ingenuity that had kept him alive through court-martial and exile. The empathy that had made him burn his reserves for a dying stranger. The moral conviction that had cost him everything and somehow led here. "Your sister," he said, connecting pieces. "The one who poisoned you." "The one who wears my crown." Tyria's voice went cold, veins flickering in patterns he'd tentatively labeled as rage. The one who would glass entire moons rather than negotiate. The one who believes strength is measured in corpses. Alvin looked at their joined hands, thought about the empty vial she'd kept, the kiss on his palm that still felt like fire 3 days later. Thought about Kale 9 shrinking behind them, and the 5 corvettes that represented everything left of a Crown Heir's loyalists. Thought about the court-martial, the civilians he'd saved, the choice to care when protocol said to cut losses. "Teach you improvisation," he repeated. "Make your 5 ships fight like 50. "Make them fight like humans." She smiled, and it transformed her face from regal to radiant. Dirty, unpredictable, willing to break every rule if it means survival. Around them, the nightshade hummed with power. The loyalist captain barked orders in Velari, and the ship began its burnout of Kale 9's gravity well. Through the hangar's atmospheric shield, Alvin watched the asteroid dwindle to a point of light, then vanish entirely. "I'm court-martialed," he said. "Disgraced. Human command probably has a warrant for my arrest." "Then you'll fit perfectly with my crew of exiles and loyalists." Tyria released his hand but stepped closer, close enough that he smelled copper and crushed petals, close enough that her veins' glow cast shadows on his skin. "Besides, my medic, you've already committed treason by saving me. Might as well make it comprehensive." The ship jumped to faster than light. Reality twisted, settled, became a star-streaked corridor of impossible physics, and Alvin, disgraced combat medic and field engineer, found himself laughing for the first time in 6 months. "Comprehensive treason," he said. "That's definitely going on my resume." Tyria's veins spiraled in patterns that looked almost like joy. The garden moon appeared like a jewel in black velvet. Virili hung in space against the backdrop of a gas giant's rust-red storms, its surface a patchwork of bioluminescent forests and silver rivers that caught the light from twin suns. Floating gardens drifted in the upper atmosphere, tethered to the surface by force field anchors that shimmered like heat mirrorages. Even through the nightshade's viewports, Alvin could see the geothermal vents, great plumes of steam rising from volcanic hot springs, their heat creating permanent updrafts where winged creatures spiraled in aerial dances. Home, Tyria said beside him, voice soft with something that might have been grief or longing or both. The only territory my sister's fleets haven't touched. Too remote, too difficult to hold strategically. She thinks I'm hiding here out of fear. Are you? Alvin asked, because in 3 days aboard the Nightshade he'd learned that Tyria valued directness over diplomacy. I'm hiding here out of necessity. Her reflection in the viewport showed veins pulsing in slow, measured patterns. 5 ships cannot retake an empire, but 5 ships can survive long enough to become more. She turned to face him fully. If the human variable is as adaptable as I believe. The landing was controlled chaos. Corvettes descending through atmosphere in staggered formation, point defense systems tracking everything larger than a bird, the loyalist captain's gravelly voice barking coordinates in Veilari that Alvin's translator chip rendered as precision poetry. They touched down on a plateau overlooking a valley where bioluminescent trees grew tall enough to scrape low clouds, their trunks pulsing with the same subdermal light patterns that marked Tyria's skin. The air hit him first when they disembarked. Warm, humid, carrying scents of mineral-rich water and vegetation he had no names for. Not hostile like Kale 9's metallic dust, but alive in a way that made his lungs expand involuntarily. Twin suns painted everything in dual shadows, gold and amber overlapping. Come, Tyria said, already moving down a path carved from volcanic stone. I'll show you why this moon is worth defending. The royal compound. She called it that, though it looked more like a series of organic structures grown from living wood, sprawled across the plateau in elegant chaos. Quarters for her 5 crews, medical facilities that made Kale 9's medbay look like a historical curiosity, armories, training yards, and at the center, a geothermal bath complex that steamed under the twin suns like a promise. Tyria led him past all of it, down winding paths where violet flowers bloomed from cracks in the stone, to a private chamber carved into the cliff face itself. The interior was spare, sleeping platform, storage alcoves, a viewport overlooking the valley, but the wall opposite the entrance was covered in circuitry that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns he'd learned to read on her skin. Neural interface, she explained, touching the wall. The circuits responded, rippling outward from her fingertips. Every Veilari noble's chambers include one. We plug our consciousness directly into planetary defense grids, communication networks, even historical archives. She paused, fingers still pressed to the glowing lines. My sister uses hers to spy on her subjects. I use mine to remember why I'm fighting. She stepped back from the wall, and the circuits dimmed. Then she began removing her armor. Piece by piece, with the same deliberate care she'd shown in everything since they'd met. The way she'd pressed the empty vial to her lips. The way she'd taken his hand on the Nightshade's hangar deck. The breastplate first, revealing the black underlayer that clung to green skin. The vambraces next, sliding free to expose her forearms where bioluminescent veins formed constellations. What are you doing? Alvin asked, though his throat was tight and his hands had stopped being entirely steady somewhere around the 3rd piece of armor. Showing you the truth. The high collar fell away. The poison wasn't random. My sister administered it herself, mixed into ceremonial wine during the Feast of Succession. Her voice cracked slightly. She gave me a choice: support her plan to glass the rebel moon of Kethris, killing 3 million civilians, or drink. The armor pooled at her feet. She stood in just the underlayer, matte black that left her arms, throat, and collarbones bare, and those veins pulsed in erratic patterns he'd learned meant fear or shame. I drank, she whispered. Walked to my personal shuttle, activated the emergency beacon, and aimed for the nearest human-occupied system, praying someone, anyone, would find me before the toxin stopped my heart. Her gold eyes met his. 5 ships. That's all who answered the beacon before my sister locked down communications. 5 crews out of an empire that spans 12 systems. Alvin closed the distance between them. His calloused hands found her shoulders, thumbs tracing the injection sites at her collarbones where he'd administered the first dose 72 hours into the crisis. Healed now, but still visible as faint discoloration against emerald skin. You chose 3 million strangers over your own safety, he said quietly. That's not shame, that's the opposite. My sister calls it weakness. Her fingers came up to cover his hands, holding them against her skin. She says empathy is a luxury empires can't afford. Your sister is wrong. He'd said something similar to a tribunal once, right before they'd court-martialed him. The civilians' lives mattered more than mission parameters. Some things were worth losing everything for. Empires that can't afford empathy don't deserve to survive. Tyria made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Her veins spiraled in patterns he'd never seen before, overlapping pulses that seemed to originate from wherever his hands touched her skin and radiate outward. Then she was kissing him. Not the formal kiss on his palm from Kale 9. This was desperate and certain at once, her mouth on his with enough pressure to make his breath stop. 4 fingers sliding into his dark hair, claws retracted but the thread of them present, intimate. She tasted like the copper and petals scent he'd been learning to associate with safety. And when he kissed back, one hand sliding to the small of her back, the other cradling her jaw, her veins flared bright enough to cast shadows on the chamber walls. They broke apart, gasping. Her pupils were fully dilated, vertical slits lost in liquid gold. His heart hammered against his ribs hard enough to hurt. The baths, she said, voice wrecked. I need to show you the baths. The geothermal springs were a short walk, but felt like miles. They passed crews training in the yards, Velari soldiers who stopped to salute Tyria with fists over hearts, their bioluminescent veins flashing in patterns that might have been respect or curiosity or both. The springs themselves were terraced pools carved from volcanic rock, steam rising in curtains that turned the twin suns into diffuse gold. Tyria stripped without ceremony. The underlayer peeled away to reveal green skin marked with scars Alvin hadn't seen before, a blade wound along her ribs, burn marks on her left thigh, the silvered line of something that had nearly opened her throat. Battle scars, assassination attempts, the map of a crown heir who'd survived her own court. She stepped into the nearest pool without looking back, water rising to her waist, steam wrapping around her shoulders. Her bioluminescent veins flared bright in the heat, tracing patterns from spine to fingertips that looked almost like circuit diagrams. When she turned to face him, water sluicing off emerald skin, her expression was open in a way he'd never seen. Your turn, my medic. Alvin's hands went to his jumpsuit seals. He'd been a field medic for 9 years. Modesty was a luxury trauma triage didn't afford, but his fingers hesitated anyway. The scars on his chest from shrapnel, the chemical burns on his forearms, the crooked set of ribs that had healed wrong during a supply shortage. His body was a catalog of every time he'd been too slow or too stubborn or too willing to take risks no one else would. He stripped, stepped into water that was almost too hot, felt it seep into muscles that had been tense since Kale 9. Tyria moved closer, water rippling between them until her hands found his chest. These, she traced the shrapnel scars with 4 fingers, claws retracted completely. Tell me you stood between something fragile and something violent. Civilian transport under fire. His voice came out rougher than intended. Corporate raid. I jury-rigged the medical drone swarm to form a shield wall. Saved 43 people. He paused. Got court-martialed because the drones were worth more than civilian lives, according to the tribunal. Her veins pulsed in patterns he'd learned meant rage on someone else's behalf. She leaned forward and pressed her mouth to the largest scar, right over his sternum. Not a kiss, something more deliberate. Claiming the wound, maybe, or honoring it. When she pulled back, her eyes were molten gold. The human variable, she said. Empathy that defies cost-benefit analysis. Ingenuity that turns mining drones into saviors. Moral conviction that survives even court-martial. Her hands slid up to frame his face. That's what I need. Not just to survive, but to become something better than my sister's empire of corpses. Alvin caught her wrists, gently held them between their bodies. I can teach your people improvisation, turn your 5 ships into a force that punches above its weight. But Tyria... He made sure she was looking at him. If you want to take back your throne, you can't become the thing you're fighting against, no matter how much easier it would be. Something shifted in her expression. The regal mask cracked completely, and underneath was raw vulnerability that made his chest ache. She's my sister, my blood. The poison should have been impossible. We were raised together, trained together. I keep wondering what I missed, what sign I ignored that would have. He kissed her to stop the spiral. Soft at first, then deeper when her hands fisted in his hair and her body pressed against his in the steaming water. Her veins spiraled in patterns that felt like surrender and reclamation at once. When they broke apart, her forehead rested against his, breath mingling in the space between mouths. "We have time," he said. 5 ships, 1 moon, and however long it takes to build something worth fighting for. His hands found the small of her back, traced the knobs of her spine. But we do it without becoming her. That's non-negotiable. Tyria's laugh was shaky but genuine, my human issuing ultimatums to a crown heir. "Your medic," he corrected, "reminding you that empires built on corpses don't last." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "Besides, you already chose 3 million strangers over safety. I'm just asking you to keep choosing." Her veins dimmed to soft, steady waves. The pattern he'd first learned meant peace. She nodded once, decisive, then took his hand and led him deeper into the pool where the water was hot enough to make his skin flush. They stayed there until the twin suns set and the bioluminescent forest below came alive with light, 2 exiles learning each other's scars in volcanic heat, while 5 corvettes kept watch overhead. 2 weeks into Virili's refuge, and Alvin had turned the moon's defense grid into something that gave the Veilari chief engineer a nervous breakdown. "This is heresy," the tech priest sputtered, glowing circuit tattoos on his scalp flickering with agitation as he stared at Alvin's modifications to the atmospheric monitoring system. "You've connected mining drones to orbital sensors using code that violates 17 principles of proper architecture." "But it works." Alvin didn't look up from his diagnostic tablet, fingers dancing across the screen to fine-tune the response threshold. The mining drones he'd salvaged from Kale 9's inventory database, purchased through creative reallocation of the Nightshade's maintenance budget, now formed a network of mobile sensor platforms that could detect incoming ships 3 times faster than the static arrays. "Your fixed installations are fine for map threats. This gives you coverage for everything else." The chief engineer made a sound like escaping steam. His circuit tattoos pulsed in what Alvin had learned was the Veilari equivalent of a migraine. "Crown Heir, please instruct your human that systems require." Results. Tyria's voice cut through the command center with regal finality. She stood at the central holotable where fleet positions glowed in 3 dimensions, violet hair braided back, wearing tactical armor that managed to be both practical and devastating. "The human variable delivers results. Adapt or requisition yourself to the support crews." The chief engineer fled, muttering in technical Veilari that Alvin's translator chip rendered as variations on crude and impossible. Alvin allowed himself a small smile and returned to his work. The modifications had started simple: tightening patrol routes, updating friend or foe protocols, teaching the Corvette pilots how to mask their power signatures using tricks he'd learned keeping Kale 9's systems running during dust storms. But Tyria's warriors had absorbed the lessons like desert sand, drinking water, and their hunger for more had pushed him deeper into creative problem-solving. "Show me," Tyria said, appearing at his shoulder with the silent grace he'd learned meant she'd been practicing stealth approaches. Her hand rested on his back, just above his belt, a casual touch that still made his pulse spike. Alvin pulled up the tactical display. "Your standard doctrine has ships operating in fixed formations, alpha, beta, gamma wings with predetermined engagement zones." He highlighted 3 corvettes running patrol patterns. "It's clean, textbook perfect, and utterly predictable. Any competent fleet commander sees you coming from 10 light minutes out." "And your solution?" She leaned closer, her scent copper and crushed petals mixing with the recycled air of the command center. "Chaos doctrine." He reprogrammed the display, and the ship's movements became erratic. Each corvette gets autonomous authority to break formation based on real-time threat assessment. They look scattered, disorganized, like they're barely holding together. His fingers traced pursuit vectors. But they're actually responding to shared sensor data through the mining drone network, creating overlapping fields of fire that enemy targeting solutions can't predict. Tyria studied the simulation with those gold eyes that missed nothing. You're teaching them to fight like humans, like you fought on Kale 9, improvising, adapting, using tools that weren't designed for warfare. I'm teaching them to survive when outgunned. He met her gaze. 5 ships can't match your sister's fleet in straight combat, but 5 ships that fight dirty? That use every asteroid, every sensor shadow, every moment of enemy confusion? He smiled without humor. That's how exiles become legends. She kissed him then, in front of the command center crew, in front of the sensor operators and tactical officers who were carefully not watching. Her mouth was fierce on his, claiming, and when she pulled back, her veins spiraled in patterns that made his hands want to map her skin. Tonight, she said, voice pitched for his ears only, you'll teach me more about human improvisation, the non-tactical variety. The training yards became Alvin's second home. He spent hours with Tyria's warriors, 5 crews of hardened soldiers who'd followed their crown heir into exile, teaching them to think sideways. They'd been trained in rigid Veilari military doctrine, honor-bound combat, formal dueling stances, weapons techniques refined over centuries. He taught them to cheat. Tripwires, he demonstrated rigging monofilament across a training corridor at ankle height. Don't care about honor codes. Your enemy expects frontal assault. You give them a face full of deck plate instead. The warriors absorbed everything. He showed them how to rig mining charges into shaped charges, how to hack automated systems to create false sensor readings, how to turn maintenance tunnels into ambush points. The loyalist captain with the silver-streaked braid watched from the observation deck, her cybernetic arm whirring softly, and when their eyes met, she gave him a nod that felt like acceptance. Your human is dangerous, she told Tyria one night, when they thought Alvin was out of earshot. He was beneath a training platform, installing pressure sensors, and the deck plates carried voices like confession. He makes our people think like saboteurs instead of soldiers. He makes them think like survivors, Tyria replied, her voice carrying the weight of command. My sister's fleets are 300 ships strong. If we fight like soldiers, we die like soldiers. If we fight like Alvin fights, like humans fight, we might actually take back what she stole. That night, in the private chamber overlooking the bioluminescent forest, Tyria mapped his scars with her mouth. Started at the shrapnel wounds on his chest, traced down to the chemical burns on his forearms, lingered on his calloused knuckles. Her veins pulsed bright in the darkness, casting green-gold light across tangled sheets. My engineer, she whispered against his skin, my human who makes impossible things work. Alvin's hands found her hips, pulled her closer until their bodies aligned in ways that made her breath hitch. Your medic, he corrected, then proved he'd learned the pressure points that made her gasp in Veilari, her veins flaring in patterns he now recognized as pure ecstasy. Outside, 5 corvettes orbited Virale in chaotic patterns that would make any military academy instructor weep. And in the command center, mining drones hummed through their patrols, crude and effective and utterly heretical. The human variable was adapting nicely. The warning came at dawn, or what passed for dawn on a moon with twin suns that rose in sequence. Alvin was in the armory, showing 3 Veilari engineers how to modify mining charges into proximity mines, when the proximity alarms screamed. Not 5 contacts this time, 37. He sprinted to the command center, engineers trailing behind, and found organized chaos. Tactical officers barking coordinates in clipped Veilari, the holotable lit up with red threat markers dropping out of faster than light in a perfect encirclement formation. And at the center of it all, Tyria, spine rigid, veins pulsing in patterns he'd learned meant controlled fury. 17 corvettes, 15 destroyers, 5 heavy cruisers. The loyalist captain's gravely voice cut through the noise. All broadcasting the Dominion royal seal. Your sister isn't hiding her involvement anymore, Crown Heir. She's forcing my hand. Tyria's fingers danced across the holotable, pulling up fleet compositions, weapon ranges, probable engagement timings. Encirclement means she wants me alive. Dead, I'm a martyr. Broken publicly, I'm a cautionary tale. Alvin moved to her side, his eyes already calculating angles. How long until they're in firing position? 40 minutes. The captain's cybernetic arm whirred as she manipulated secondary displays. They'll demand surrender first. Protocol requires it, even in civil war. We can't run, Tyria said flatly. Viralized geothermal vents power everything. The atmospheric shields, the command center, the gardens. Abandoning it means abandoning the only infrastructure we have. Alvin studied the tactical display, his court-martialed brain already running scenarios. 37 ships against 5, 7-to-1 odds. In conventional warfare, it was a massacre waiting to happen. But he'd spent 2 weeks teaching Tyria's people to fight unconventionally, and Virili had resources no one had weaponized yet. The geothermal vents, he said slowly. How much energy are we talking about? The chief engineer, who'd been carefully avoiding Alvin since the mining drone incident, looked up sharply. Each vent generates approximately 40 terawatts of thermal output. There are 23 active vents across Virili's surface. Why? Because thermal energy creates electromagnetic interference. Alvin's fingers flew across his tablet, pulling up geological surveys, power distribution networks, atmospheric composition data. And EM interference disrupts targeting solutions, sensor arrays, and communication relays. If we could redirect that energy... You want to turn my moon into a weapon? Tyria's voice was flat, unreadable. Her veins pulsed in complicated patterns, fear and hope and something that might have been pride. I want to level the playing field. He looked at her directly. Your sister expects you to surrender or die fighting. She doesn't expect you to make her entire fleet blind and deaf for the 30 seconds it takes your 5 corvettes to scatter into the asteroid belt. The command center went silent. Every Velari present understood the implications. This was the human variable at its most audacious. This was improvisation that broke not just doctrine, but physics. The ecosystem, the chief engineer protested weakly. Redirecting geothermal output on that scale would destabilize. I can compensate. Alvin was already sketching power distribution modifications. We don't need to sustain it, just a pulse. 3 seconds of maximum output funneled through the atmospheric ionization layers. The EM burst dissipates naturally, the vents return to normal function, and Virili survives intact. Theoretically, the engineer added, circuit tattoos flickering frantically. Practically, Alvin countered. I've kept failing life support systems running on asteroids where one miscalculation meant death. I can keep your moon alive. Tyria studied him for a long moment. Her hand found his beneath the hollow table's edge, fingers lacing through his, and her veins pulsed in patterns that felt like absolute trust. How long do you need? 35 minutes to rig the control systems, 5 minutes to position your corvettes for maximum escape vector efficiency. He squeezed her hand. And someone needs to be at the geothermal control station to trigger it manually. The timing has to be perfect. EM pulse hits exactly when her fleet commits to orbital bombardment. I'll do it, the Loyalist captain said immediately. No, Tyria's voice carried command weight. You'll lead the corvette group. I need your experience keeping my people alive during the scatter. Her gold eyes found Alvin's. My engineer will handle the detonation. Tyria, he started. You said timing has to be perfect. She lifted their joined hands, pressed his knuckles to her lips. I trust you to know when perfect is. I don't trust anyone else. The communication came 20 minutes later, broadcast on all frequencies. The holotable's main screen lit up with a face Alvin had never seen but recognized instantly. Tyria's sister, the usurper queen. Same emerald skin, same liquid gold eyes, but her violet hair was shaved on one side and her expression carried the cold certainty of someone who'd never doubted her own righteousness. Sister, the word came out like ice breaking. Your rebellion ends today. Surrender yourself and I promise your followers will die quickly. Tyria stepped into the holographic pickup range, spine straight, chin level. You poisoned me at the Feast of Succession. You stole my throne. And you believe I'll surrender? I believe you'll see reason when I start glassing your garden moon. The usurper's smile was sharp enough to cut. You always cared too much about fragile things. It's why you were never fit to rule. Alvin watched Tyria's veins pulse in patterns he'd never seen. Rage and grief, and something colder threaded through with desperate control. Her hand tightened on his heart enough that he felt her claws extend slightly. Obsidian tips pressing into his skin. You have 30 minutes to evacuate, the usurper continued. After that, Virili becomes an object lesson in the cost of defiance. The transmission cut. Tyria released Alvin's hand, leaving 4 small red marks where her claws had broken skin. When she looked at him, her eyes held the weight of everything she'd lost: crown, empire, family. "Make it work," she said, "please." He touched her face, traced the bioluminescent vein that pulsed along her jaw. 35 minutes, I promise. Then he ran. The geothermal control station was carved into Virili's crust 3 kilometers below the royal compound, accessible only by service lift that descended through layers of volcanic rock. Alvin wrote it down with his tablet, a toolkit scavenged from the Nightshade's engineering bay, and the absolute certainty that he was either about to save everyone or kill them spectacularly. The station was automated, Veilari engineering at its finest, all elegant interfaces and failsafes designed to prevent exactly what he was planning. The chief engineer had transmitted override codes with a resignation that sounded like prayer. Alvin jacked his tablet into the primary control node and started rewriting reality. The geothermal vents fed power to Virili's infrastructure through a distribution network that balanced output across 23 sites. Stable, efficient, designed for sustained operation over decades. Alvin needed to turn that elegant balance into a weapon. He rerouted everything: atmospheric shields, command center power, even the bioluminescent gardens, irrigation systems, into a single capacitor array that shouldn't exist but would for approximately 3 seconds before the strain tore it apart. Above, through the station's communication link, he heard the battle develop. The usurper's fleet had committed to orbital bombardment formation, weapons hot, targeting solutions locked on every structure the sensors could identify. Tyria's 5 corvettes were positioned in a scatter pattern that looked panicked, engines cold, drifting like debris, exactly the kind of broken formation that invited predators to close for the kill. "My engineer." Tyria's voice came through his comm, steady despite the circumstances. She was aboard the Nightshade, coordinating the evacuation of non-combat personnel to the corvette's cargo holds. Status? 90 seconds. His fingers flew across the tablet, connecting power conduits that had never been designed to touch. The tablet screamed warnings. He ignored them. "When the pulse hits, you'll have maybe 30 seconds of total sensor blackout across her entire fleet. Use it." "We will." A pause. "Alvin, if this doesn't—" "It will." He refused to consider alternatives. The court-martial had taught him that some gambles only worked if you committed completely. Trust the human variable. 60 seconds. The usurper's fleet tightened formation, preparing to deliver simultaneous strikes that would crack Virili's crust and boil its atmosphere, the kind of overwhelming force that left no room for survival. Above in the command center, the chief engineer was probably having a complete breakdown, watching his elegant systems get repurposed into a doomsday device. 30 seconds. Alvin's hands moved with the steady precision of a combat medic, same focus that had let him stabilize Tyria while toxin ate her nervous system, same refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure. The capacitor array was charging, thermal energy building to levels that made the control station's temperature spike 15 degrees. 15 seconds. The first bombardment salvo launched, kinetic penetrators that would reach Virili's surface in 10 seconds, energy weapons that would fire in synchronization to punch through atmospheric shields. Above, Tyria gave the order for corvette engines to hot start. The scatter would begin the instant sensors came back online. 10 seconds. Alvin's thumb hovered over the manual override, a physical switch because some things were too important to trust to software. The station's automated safeties screamed at him in Veilarian Standard both, warning of catastrophic system failure, ecological disaster, imminent death. 5 seconds. He thought about Tyria's hand in his, about teaching her warriors to fight dirty, about the empty vial she'd kept as a memento. Thought about the 3 million civilians on Kethris she'd chosen over safety. Some things were worth burning everything for. 0. He slammed the override. Virili erupted. 23 geothermal vents simultaneously channeled their output through the atmospheric ionization layers, converting thermal energy into the largest electromagnetic pulse the moon had ever generated. The effect was instantaneous, a sphere of disruption that expanded at light speed, washing over the usurper's fleet like a tsunami of static. Every sensor went blind, every targeting solution dissolved, every communication relay turned to white noise. 37 warships suddenly became 37 pieces of very expensive metal drifting in formation without eyes or ears or coordination. Above, the Nightshade and 4 sister corvettes ignited engines at maximum burn. The scatter pattern that had looked panicked revealed itself as precisely calculated, 5 vectors that threaded through the fleet formation while every ship was deaf and blind, close enough to trigger collision alarms that no one could hear, fast enough that by the time sensors recovered, they'd be light minutes away. Alvin watched it unfold through the control station's displays, data streaming in from the mining drone network that had been hardened against EM interference because he'd built them that way. The usurper's kinetic penetrators missed every target, slamming into empty plateau where the command center had stood 60 seconds ago, evacuated according to plan. Energy weapons fired on automated timers, hitting nothing but atmosphere. And in the chaos, 5 small ships vanished into the asteroid belt like ghosts. The EM pulse dissipated. Virilized geothermal vents returned to normal output, the capacitor array melting into slag but the ecosystem intact. The control station's temperature began dropping. Alvin's hands were shaking now, delayed reaction, adrenaline crash, but his tablet showed green across every critical system. "Talk to me, my engineer," Tyria's voice on the comm, breathless and vibrant. "Did we?" "You're clear." He slumped against the console, grinning like an idiot. All 5 corvettes made it out. The usurper's fleet is still sorting out sensor ghosts. By the time they realize what happened, you'll be deep enough in the belt that pursuit is suicide. Her laugh was pure relief and joy mixed with something fiercer. The human variable delivers miracles. The human variable delivers improvisation, he corrected. Miracles are someone else's department. He checked the evacuation status. "How many did we get out?" "Everyone." Her voice went soft. "Every crew member, every non-combatant, even the chief engineer who was cursing your name until the moment we scattered. You saved Virili and everyone on it." The service lift began its ascent. Alvin rode it up through 3 kilometers of volcanic rock, feeling each meter like a reprieve. When he emerged into the royal compound, half destroyed by near-miss kinetic strikes but structurally intact, Tyria was waiting. She crossed the distance at a run and hit him hard enough to stagger him, arms wrapping around his shoulders, face pressed to his throat. Her veins pulsed against his skin in patterns that felt like overwhelming gratitude and relief, and something deeper he didn't have words for. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she whispered. Alvin held her, breathed in copper and crushed petals, and lied kindly. "I'll try." Around them, Virili steamed in the aftermath of weaponized geology, and somewhere in orbit, an usurper queen stared at empty space where her sister's last stronghold should have been burning, learning the hard way that 5 ships commanded by exiles who fought dirty could disappear like smoke. The usurper's fleet withdrew after 6 hours of fruitless searching. Alvin watched from the repaired command center as 37 ships jumped to faster than light in perfect formation, leaving Virili's star system empty except for debris and frustrated pride. The mining drone network tracked them until they were 3 light-years distant, then sent the all-clear. Tyria's 5 corvettes began the long burn back from the asteroid belt. "She'll return," the loyalist captain said, her cybernetic arm whirring as she compiled damage assessments. "With more ships, better sensor packages, strategies to counter your EM pulse. We bought time, not victory." "Time is victory," Alvin replied, not looking up from his tablet. He was already designing countermeasures to the countermeasures, running scenarios where the usurper adapted and he adapted faster. Every day she doesn't control Virili is another day her legitimacy cracks. 3 days later, a communication arrived through channels so encrypted that the chief engineer needed 2 hours to decrypt it. When the holotable finally displayed the message, it was short and devastating. 17 noble houses of the Velari Dominion, Minor royalty who'd stayed silent during the coup were formally requesting audience with the crown heir in exile. "They smell weakness," Tyria said, studying the list of houses. Her veins pulsed in complicated patterns, hope threaded with caution. "My sister's failure to crush me makes her look fallible. They're hedging their bets." "Or they're genuinely loyal," Alvin offered. "You chose 3 million civilians over your crown. That kind of integrity is rare enough to inspire faith." She looked at him with those liquid gold eyes that had learned to soften around him. "My optimistic human, what do you recommend?" "Meet them." He pulled up star charts, highlighted a neutral moon 2 systems away. Heavily populated, impossible to blockade without drawing attention. Public venue, plenty of witnesses. Make them declare their allegiance where everyone can see. The summit took 3 weeks to arrange. Tyria's 5 corvettes arrived in a system so crowded with commercial traffic that military action would have been political suicide. The neutral moon hosted the gathering in an amphitheater that had seen centuries of Veilari diplomatic negotiations, its seats carved from crystal that amplified bioluminescent light until the space glowed like the inside of a star. 17 noble houses sent representatives. Tyria arrived in full ceremonial armor, matte black with silver filigree, high collar framing her throat, violet hair braided with precious metals. Alvin walked 2 steps behind her right shoulder, wearing simple black tactical gear that marked him clearly as human, as other, as the variable that had kept her alive. The representatives stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disgust. One, a young heir whose circuit tattoos marked him as tech caste, couldn't stop looking at Alvin with obvious fascination. "Crown heir," the eldest representative spoke, her veins dimmed with age, but her voice sharp. "We watched your sister's fleet fail to capture you. We watched a moon that should have burned stay green. We heard rumors of human engineering, of tactics no Veilari commander would consider." She paused significantly. "We heard your human used mining equipment to defeat 17 warships." "My engineer," Tyria corrected, the possessive pronoun deliberate, "used improvisation to defeat overwhelming force. Yes." "Heresy," someone muttered, several others nodded agreement. "Survival," Alvin said quietly, and every eye turned to him. He met their gazes without flinching. "Your crown heir was outnumbered 7-1. Traditional tactics meant death. I gave her a third option." "You gave her chaos," the elderly representative said, but her tone wasn't entirely critical. "The kind of unpredictable warfare that makes proper strategy impossible." A pause. "The kind that might actually break my usurper queen's numerical advantage." The amphitheater went silent. Tyria's veins pulsed in patterns Alvin recognized as controlled anticipation. This was the moment. Either these houses committed or they'd been wasting 3 weeks. "I'm not asking you to follow me blindly," Tyria said, voice carrying in the crystalline space. "I'm asking you to choose what kind of empire you want. My sister offers strength through domination. I offer strength through adaptation." She extended one hand toward Alvin. "The human variable, empathy, ingenuity, moral conviction, is the future. Either we integrate it or we stagnate." "And if we refuse," someone challenged, "then you remain neutral and hope my sister's mercy is more reliable than her ambition." Tyria's smile was sharp. "But if you accept, I offer joint governance, a council of houses where human perspective balances Veilari tradition, where improvisation and doctrine inform each other instead of competing." The debate lasted 6 hours. Alvin watched from his position behind Tyria's shoulder, saying nothing, letting her fight this battle with words instead of weapons. The representatives argued about tradition, about the contamination of human ideas, about whether a crown heir who'd been poisoned by her own sister could be trusted to rule. Finally, the elderly representative stood. "I remember the Feast of Succession," she said quietly. "I saw your sister pour that wine. I said nothing because speaking meant death." Her veins pulsed with shame. "You chose honor over survival. That makes you more fit to rule than any amount of military strength." She pressed her fist to her heart in formal salute. "House Keltharin stands with the crown heir in exile." One by one, the others followed. 16 houses total. One representative quietly fled rather than commit. But 16 houses meant 16 private fleets, 16 manufacturing centers, 16 territories that would resist the usurper's control. 5 corvettes had become 23. That night, in a borrowed suite overlooking the neutral moon's commerce district, Tyria finally broke. She stood at the viewport, still in her ceremonial armor, and her shoulders shook with silent tears. Alvin crossed the distance and wrapped his arms around her from behind, felt her lean back into him with the weight of someone who'd been holding themselves together through sheer will. "I'm abdicating partial rule," she whispered. "Creating a council means I'm no longer crown heir in the absolute sense. My ancestors ruled alone for 3,000 years, and I'm creating something better." He turned her to face him, wiped tears from green cheeks. "Your sister rules through fear. You're ruling through cooperation. That's not weakness, Tyria. That's evolution." Her veins spiraled in patterns he'd learned meant overwhelming emotion, grief and relief and love so fierce it made his chest ache. She kissed him desperately, fingers tangling in his hair, armor pressing against his tactical gear with metallic whispers. "My human," she breathed against his mouth. "My engineer who breaks every rule and somehow makes it work." "Your medic," he corrected, then kissed her deeper. "Your partner, your variable." They made it to the sleeping platform eventually, armor discarded piece by piece, revealing scars in bioluminescent veins and skin that had learned each other's topography by heart. When she gasped his name in Veilari, veins flaring bright enough to paint the ceiling in green-gold light, Alvin thought about the empty vial she'd kept, about the journey from dying alien to crown heir to something more complex than either. Outside, 16 noble houses prepared for war. But inside, 2 exiles found peace in each other's arms, rewriting the future one improvised moment at a time. 6 months later, the war ended not with bombardment but bureaucracy. The Council of Houses had grown to 31. The usurper queen's grip on the dominion cracked, as system after system quietly shifted allegiance to the crown heir in exile, who offered joint governance instead of domination. When her own flagship's crew mutinied and delivered her to Tyria in chains, it felt less like climax and more like inevitable conclusion. Alvin watched from the mobile command vehicle he'd designed, part armored transport, part engineering laboratory, all improvisation, as Veilari justice played out. The usurper knelt before Tyria in the same amphitheater where 17 houses had first pledged loyalty. Her violet hair was shorn, her ceremonial armor stripped away, leaving her in simple gray that echoed Alvin's first Kale 9 jumpsuit. "Sister," Tyria said, voice carrying across crystal that amplified her bioluminescent patterns into constellations, "you poisoned me, you stole my throne, you ordered the deaths of millions." A pause that felt like the space between heartbeats. "By traditional law, I should execute you publicly." The usurper lifted her chin in defiance. "Then do it. Prove you're strong enough to rule." "I'm proving," Tyria said quietly, "that strength and mercy aren't mutually exclusive." She looked to the council, 31 representatives, and in the place of honor, Alvin in his simple black tactical gear. The human variable teaches us that some variables are worth preserving, even when they cost us. The sentence was life imprisonment in a rehabilitation facility, with the possibility of eventual reintegration if she proved capable of empathy. The council voted 28-3 in favor. The usurper was led away, her expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been grudging respect. That night, in the royal suite of Virili's rebuilt compound, reconstructed with human engineering principles woven through Veilari elegance, Tyria finally allowed herself to stop being crown heir and become simply herself. She stood on the balcony overlooking bioluminescent forests that had survived weaponized geology and imperial ambition both. Her hair was unbound, violet strands catching starlight from twin moons. She wore nothing but a thin sleeping robe that revealed the graceful architecture of green shoulders, the constellation of bioluminescent veins along her collarbones pulsing in slow, peaceful waves. Alvin joined her, his calloused hands finding her waist from behind. 6 months of war councils and tactical improvisation and stolen moments between crises had taught him the topography of her body. Every scar, every pressure point that made her gasp, every pattern her veins formed when she felt safe. Consort, she said, the title still strange on her tongue. The council had formalized it 3 days ago in a ceremony that blended Velari tradition with human simplicity. That's what they're calling you now, my human consort who rewrote the rules of empire. You're medic, he corrected against her neck, breathing in copper and crushed petals. You're engineer. You're variable. His lips traced the pulse at her throat where he'd administered that first desperate injection 8 months ago. Titles don't change what we are. She turned in his arms, liquid gold eyes searching his face in the darkness. And what are we? Survivors. He cupped her jaw, thumb tracing the bioluminescent vein that pulsed along her cheekbone. Exiles who found each other when we had nothing. Partners who built an empire on improvisation and empathy. He kissed her softly. Everything that matters. Tyria's veins spiraled in patterns he'd learned meant overwhelming emotion. Love threaded through with fierce possession. Her four-fingered hands found his chest, mapping the shrapnel scars through his shirt with reverent precision. Take this off, she whispered. I want to feel your skin. He stripped efficiently, field medic practicality that still made her breath catch. 6 months hadn't dulled the impact of weathered human skin against her green palms, the contrast of species that shouldn't work, but did. Her hands traced every scar, shrapnel wounds from civilian evacuation, chemical burns from improvised engineering, the healed claw marks on his palm from that first desperate night. These tell your story, she said, fingers lingering on the largest scar over his sternum. Every choice to save someone when protocol said to cut losses. She pressed her mouth to the scar, not kissing but claiming. Every time you chose empathy over efficiency. Alvin's hands found the tie of her robe, pulled slowly. The fabric whispered open, revealing emerald skin he'd memorized through crisis and peace both. His fingers traced the injection sites at her collarbones, healed completely but still visible as faint discoloration, then lower to the blade scar along her ribs, the burn marks on her thigh, the silvered line across her throat from an assassination attempt years before they'd met. Your turn, he said. Every scar is a moment you survived when someone wanted you dead. She shivered under his touch, veins flaring bright in the darkness. My human who sees value in survival instead of shame in scars. He walked her backward into the suite, their bodies aligned in ways that 8 months had made instinctive. The sleeping platform was wide enough for 2 species' needs, sheets that breathed and adapted to temperature, another compromise between human and Velari design. When her back met the mattress, she pulled him down with hands that trembled slightly. I'm nervous, she admitted, vulnerability cracking through her regal bearing. This is the first time since the war ended, the first time without wondering if tomorrow brings bombardment or betrayal. Alvin settled his weight carefully, forearms bracketing her head, their faces inches apart. Then we go slow. We have all night and no proximity alarms to interrupt us. He kissed her with deliberate tenderness, not the desperate claiming of crisis, but the patient exploration of peace. His mouth mapped her jaw, the pulse point at her throat, the hollow of her collarbone where bioluminescent veins formed intricate lattices. When he pressed his lips to the injection site, she made a sound that was half sob, half pleasure. Here, she gasped, guiding his hand to a pressure point just below her ribs. Velari nerve cluster. If you press and hold... He did. Her back arched, veins blazing in patterns that looked like cascading stars, her mouth falling open on a cry that was pure Velari, clicks and harmonics that bypassed his translator chip and went straight to hindbrain satisfaction. He held the pressure, watching her biology respond, learning the syntax of her ecstasy with the same focus he'd brought to keeping her alive. Again, she demanded when she could speak, my human who learns too quickly for his own good. He smiled against her sternum, traced a path lower with his mouth, found another nerve cluster at her hip she'd shown him weeks ago in the geothermal baths, and used teeth this time. Her hands fisted in his hair, claws extending just enough to prick his scalp without drawing blood. The edge of danger heightened everything. When she rolled them over, straddling his hips with green thighs bracketing his waist, her veins pulsed in patterns that meant fierce determination. My turn to map you, she said, voice wrecked and commanding at once. My turn to learn what makes the human variable lose control. Her mouth found his throat, teeth scraping gently. Her hands traced his ribs, his abdomen, lower until his breath stopped entirely. She learned him with the same systematic precision he'd brought to her biology, testing, adapting, noting what made him gasp versus what made him curse. When she used the edge of her claws on his inner thigh, he nearly came apart. "There," she said with satisfaction, "my human isn't so controlled after all." They came together slowly, bodies that had learned each other through crisis, now exploring peace. Her veins flared in rhythmic pulses that matched their movement, green-gold light painting shadows on skin and sheets. Alvin's hands gripped her hips, guiding without controlling, his steel-gray eyes locked on liquid gold. When she whispered his name in Veilari, the clicks shaped around syllables her tongue had learned just for him, he felt the sound in his chest like percussion. "Say it again," he demanded, voice rough. She leaned down, lips against his ear, and obeyed. The intimacy of it, his name shaped by alien vocal anatomy, offered in the language of her people, pushed him over the edge. He pulled her down into a kiss that was more collision than coordination, holding her through the aftershocks while her veins spiraled in patterns so bright they lit the entire suite. After, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like copper and crushed petals and human sweat. Tyria traced the scars on his chest with one claw tip, retracted enough to be gentle, extended enough to remind him what she could do if she chose. Her head rested over his heart, listening to the rhythm that had steadied her through toxin and war both. 5 ships were only the beginning, she whispered against his skin. Now we have 31 houses, 17 systems, and a council that argues for 6 hours about agricultural subsidies. Alvin laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest into her ear. From dying in my medbay to bureaucratic empire, that's quite a journey. Our journey, she lifted her head to meet his eyes. The human variable and the crown heir who learned that empathy is strength, not weakness. Partners, he corrected, pulling her up for another kiss. Variables that adapted each other until we fit. Outside, Virili's bioluminescent forests pulsed with their own rhythms. Twin moons rose in sequence, casting dual shadows across reconstructed compounds where human and Veilari engineering had learned to speak the same language. And in the royal suite, 2 exiles who'd found each other when they had nothing, slept, wrapped around each other, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring council meetings and engineering challenges and the ongoing work of building something better than what came before. The human variable had delivered more than survival. It had delivered hope. And in Tyria's arms, Alvin finally allowed him